Hello there, kia ora. Welcome to this week's episode of Campaign Kōrero. We're just going to take a sit down and look at some of the headlines that have made news this week because, well, to be honest, a lot of the news stuff that I want to do an interview on has been right up to the line on Tuesday to get information across. So it's just easier to not talk to people with only half the information available because otherwise you end up voting for places like ACT and New Zealand First. So let's jump straight into finding out some of the headlines that have surrounded this year's election campaign. The coalition government's recent fanfare surrounding a funding boost for primary healthcare has been exposed as a shell game, with reporting revealing that the new general practice or GP cash injection was quietly siphoned directly from hospital operational budgets. While Health New Zealand and the government touted the package as a milestone investment to relieve pressure on local doctors, internal accounting details reveal that rather than committing genuine fresh capital to a collapsing health network, funds were simply reallocated from frontline hospital and specialist care. Healthcare union leaders and opposition MPs have slammed the move, pointing out that stripping cash from regional hospitals where ED wait times, surgical backlogs and nurses shortages are already at crisis levels simply shifts financial distress from one of the health systems to another. For those dealing with frontline collapse due to government policy and cuts, the policy highlights the deep ideological failure of the government's health strategy, attempting to manage health infrastructure through zero-sum accounting tricks rather than expanding tax revenues to properly resource public services. While boosting primary care is essential to catch illnesses early, experts warn that public underfunding of hospitals to pay for it leaves acute facilities completely unable to cope when patients inevitably require secondary care. Rather than addressing systemic underinvestment across the board, the coalition's robbing Peter to pay Paul accounting leaves both frontline doctors and hospital workers fighting over scraps, sacrificing patient care on the altar of fiscal austerity. Launching its election slogan, Better Starts Here, alongside its broader fiscal plan, the Labour Party has drawn a clear contrast against National's policy of spending cuts and austerity. Speaking at a campaign kick-off, Labour leader Chris Hipkins framed the choice for voters as a stark division between 3 more years of hardship under National or a government that fights for working families through investments in housing, healthcare and costs of living relief. Central to Labour's pitch is a commitment to balance public investment with fiscal discipline. Their strategy promises a return to Obergil surplus by 2029 or 2030 and funded primarily by a targeted 28% capital gains tax on non-primary investment properties, while avoiding aggressive cuts to vital public services. For many, the combination of Labour's slogan and economic framework directly challenges the narrative that public belt tightening is the only path to fiscal responsibility. Critics of current coalition policies argue that National's rigid no new taxes stance starves public infrastructure and essential services to protect wealth and corporate profits. Labour's model, by contrast, seeks to use targeted tax measures such as ring-fencing capital gains revenue specifically to fund public health initiatives like free GP visits and prescriptions to ensure the wealthy contribute fairly. By explicitly tying the slogan Better Starts Now to investments in community welfare rather than trickle-down tax cuts, Labour aims to position itself as the party prioritising sustainable economic relief for struggling households over corporate tax breaks. The ACT Party, led by David Seymour, has once again reignited cultural conflict with its policy pitch targeting tikanga Māori and te tiriti or Waitangi clauses in legislation. Operating under the guise of one law for all and a libertarian colour-blindness, Seymour's campaign demands the systemic removal of Indigenous co-governance mechanisms, health initiatives and statutory equity clauses. Yet progressives and constitutional experts point out the profound hypocrisy at the heart of ACT rhetoric. While Seymour purports to oppose state-mandated special privileges, his agenda uses state power to strip away Indigenous self-determination or tino rangatira and undermine property rights rooted in te tiriti, ignoring the reality that blanket equality on paper merely entrenches historical disadvantage. This double standard is part of a longer pattern of political deflection. When challenged by broadcast journalists like Tova O'Brien during high-profile interviews on national media, Seymour's rigid, colour-blind doctrine regularly falls apart under scrutiny. Under intense questioning regarding targeted government protections, such as affirmative health policies for Māori or demographic equity measures, Seymour has struggled to justify why recognising systemic disparities faced by Indigenous communities is labelled feudalism, while acknowledging other demographically targeted state interventions as tolerated. Opponents argue that Seymour, who routinely invokes his own Māori heritage to shield himself from accusations of anti-Māori bias, is weaponising identity politics to fan racial anxiety among conservative voters, using culture wars to distract from his core agenda of economic deregulation and public spending cuts. The National Party, led by Christopher Luxon, has drawn a rigid fiscal line in the sand ahead of the election, committing to a strict no new taxes pledge, framed by Finance Minister Nicola Willis as disciplined fiscal management. The policy explicitly dumps previously floated proposals to tax excess bank profits and introduce a local accommodation levy to help councils fund infrastructure. However, progressive commentators and opposition MPs quickly pointed out that the deep hypocrisy behind National's ideological aversion to tax reform. By ruling out new revenue streams while public health, housing and education sectors remain severely underfunded, National stance effectively protects corporate profits, particularly those of foreign-owned Australian banks making billions in profit, at the direct expense of working-class New Zealanders who bear the burden of declining public services. This policy U-turn also highlights a glaring ideological contradiction in National's economic messaging. Just months prior, Nicola Willis publicly argued that large financial institutions needed to be taxed more fairly, explicitly signalling that National would take a bank tax policy to the campaign trail if necessary. Throwing out those plans alongside regional bed taxes leaves cash-strapped local councils without sustainable funding mechanisms, forcing local rates higher on homeowners. Critics argue that National's strategy relies on a double standard, refusing to tax wealthy corporations and capital gains under the guise of lowering costs, while ignoring how the economic model starves the public sector and leaves local communities to pay the price through reduced services and user pay charges. The Green Party has launched a major election policy pledging to fully restore and expand Kōrero ka ako school lunch programs, directly confronting the coalition government's austerity-driven overhaul of the scheme. Under the policy unveiled by co-leader Marama Davidson, the Greens plan to return meal preparation to local community suppliers and expand free meals to an additional 400 schools, feeding more than 150,000 students. Davidson slammed the government's cost-cutting measures managed by Associate Education Minister David Seymour, which stripped contracts from local kitchens and handed them to corporate suppliers, resulting in mass regional job losses, lower nutritional standards, and rampant food waste. Re-establishing a locally sourced model funded through fairer tax systems, the Greens argue ensures public money invested directly into the community's health and local economies rather than corporate bottom lines. In many ways, the battle over school lunches underscores a fundamental contradiction in the coalition's economic strategy, prioritising short-term fiscal savings at the direct expense of children's well-being and regional employment. While the government has touted its $3.60 per meal model as a cost-saving win, critics and an Auditor General report have highlighted serious deficiencies, including unproven outcomes, weak oversight, and meals that fail basic nutritional guidelines. The Greens policy exposes the hypocrisy of framing basic child nutrition as an unaffordable luxury while corporate tax loopholes remain untouched, asserting that a wealthy nation can easily afford to feed every child nutritious, locally prepared kai while human beings are placed above ideological austerity. The National Party's introduction of the Online Safety Bill, proposing a sweeping ban on social media for under-16s, has been met with harsh criticism from tech safety experts, privacy advocates and youth advocates who label the policy an ill-conceived political stunt. Spearheaded by the Prime Minister, the policy mandates that platforms enforce age verification through intrusive methods like facial recognition, digital IDs and government documentation, under threat of massive corporate fines. However, cybersecurity specialists and digital rights groups point out the severe folly and technical absurdity of the legislation, requiring every New Zealand user to hand over biometric data or official identity documents to multinational tech giants creates an unprecedented honeypot for cybercriminals, massively elevating data breaches and identity theft risks for adults and children alike. Beyond the privacy nightmare, child welfare experts also warn that heavy-handed bans do not stop online harm, they simply displace it, pointing to international evidence including Australia's troubled age verification rollouts where teenagers easily circumvented restrictions or migrated to unmoderated fringe web spaces. Experts stress that prohibition cuts young people off from digital literacy, peer support networks and essential online safety education. By ignoring expert consensus in favour of a performative, authoritarian quick fix that seems to be liked by toy makers, the coalition is opting for digital censorship over systemic platform regulation, effectively pushing vulnerable youth into less safe, darker corners of the internet while handing over New Zealanders' sensitive biometric data to big tech. The coalition government's announcement of imposing a strict 4% cap on rates increases has been slammed by local government leaders and progressive commentators as an authoritarian vote-buying intervention that will cripple essential community services. Local government Minister Simon Watts framed the cap as protecting households from rising costs, but urban planners and mayors across Aotearoa quickly exposed the policy's profound hypocrisy. While central government forces councils to pick up the tab for ageing water pipes, roading repairs and climate adaptation, it's simultaneously stripping away their ability to raise revenue. Critics point out the glaring double standard. The coalition claims to champion localism and local decision-making, yet it is using heavy-handed state power to dictate local budgets from Wellington, forcing councils into privatisation, service cuts or deferred maintenance. Economists to democracy experts agree capping rates at an arbitrary percentage, well below the inflation rate for both heavy infrastructure construction and the current CPI, is a reckless quick fix that creates a ticking financial time bomb. Opponents stress that rates fund vital public goods, including libraries, public transport, parks, water infrastructure, and community centres. By freezing local revenue while ruling out alternative funding mechanisms like local bed taxes, the government is deliberately starving local councils to score short-term political points ahead of the election. Critics warn that this strategy will ultimately leave everyday ratepayers paying far more in the long run through user-pays charges, degraded public amenities, and catastrophic infrastructure failures. And that's it for this week's update on the election campaign. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. While you're here, why not hit that like button or share the video or even subscribe to the channel. You could even become a paid YouTube member so you can see things released in advance, you get access to some exclusive content, and like all these awesome people, you get to have your name at the end of the credits as well.